Hi everyone. In today's mini lesson, we're going to be looking at different types of government that exist throughout the world. For the most part, this school year will be focusing on the government within the United States. So, looking at the separation of power between the three branches, the system of checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, different Supreme Court cases that have changed how society has run, and things like that. However, before we get to that, we're just doing a general overview of government. So, in the last mini lesson, we talked about different philosophers and how their ideas on government have influenced different governments that exist to this day. Today, we're going to talk about different types of government that have or do exist in different parts of the world. So, the learning target for this lesson is I can identify and provide examples of different types of government. For the most part, you've probably had a little bit of background knowledge on a majority of these types of government, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of definition, the type ruler they have, and different examples that exist either in history or exist to this day. The first one is probably the one you have the least amount of familiarity with, and that is the term anarchy. By Greek roots, the term anarchy means to have no ruler. An anarchy is a society where a government doesn't exist or has no authority or control over the people or hierarchies. It is highly rooted in freedom, liberty, independence, and self government, and ultimately emphasizes having unlimited individual rights. Now, this may sound great that everyone can kind of do what they want and they don't have to follow specific rules, but history has proven that a government has to exist in order for a society to be organized and to be successful. There's a reason governments exist. We talked a lot about this in the last mini lesson in terms of different philosophers' rationale as to why governments exist and what those should look like. Within an anarchy, there is no formal government system. However, that doesn't mean that society is going to be successful. The term anarchy is rooted in the French Revolution when people were trying to uprise and basically do their own thing within France. However, it also was not successful. The next term is dictatorship. This is generally the one that students are most familiar with. By definition, a dictatorship is a government with one person who has ultimate power. Generally speaking, there are no constitutional limits, which means that that person has unlimited power and there is no formal law stating that they have a limitation in terms of the things that they are able to do or are able to refuse to do. They typically use intimidation, terror, and a suppression of civil rights, which is basically a limit on civil rights in order to ensure that people are following their rule, and ultimately they're largely unsuccessful. Typically speaking, dictatorships do not last very long. People would get together, they'll form coups, they'll form rebellions or revolutions or whatever you want to call it, and basically overthrow the government. The most famous example of a dictatorship is in Nazi Germany. However, there have been several other examples throughout history. The next example is a democracy. In the next mini lesson, you're going to learn more about different types of democracies that exist because that's kind of a broad term and it's very different depending on the time in history you're talking about. By definition, the term democracy means a government where the people rule. This is a core ideal of the United Nations, which was an international organization based around this concept of individual freedoms and individual rights. There have been a lot of examples of democracy throughout history. Originally, it originated in ancient Greece and Athens when they had something called a direct democracy. Direct democracy is when every single citizen within a civilization or society or country comes together and they are responsible for making every single legal based decision. So in Athens, any male that was over 18 that was not a slave was required to be a part of every government decision. And if they did not come together on their monthly meeting in order to make important government based decisions, then they could be fined or even put in jail. Over time, that has proven not to be super successful because people are busy and they have other responsibilities and other jobs, and it's not possible to get everyone together. And even if you were able to get everyone together, then everyone has different ideas, and those different ideas can lead to further conflict, and then no one makes a decision. So, consequently, this has kind of evolved into something similar to what's seen in the United States, and that's a representative democracy. So, a representative democracy is when people come together over a certain period of time and they vote for the people that are representing them in government. And those people are typically people that are trained in law or politics or military or something that's going to be advantageous in terms of being a part of the government on that scale. The next type is a monarchy. A monarchy is a government where the head of state is established through a hereditary. So, what that means is it's passed down from generation to generation. Within ancient monarchies, it was typically passed down to the oldest male in a family. However, a lot of monarchies either one, don't exist anymore, two, are more of a figurehead where they are there for ceremonial purposes and don't actually have a lot of legal power, or three, have kind of evolved so it's more inclusive of different um, rules in terms of who can take power. So, for example, the oldest daughter may be able to become a queen. So, generally, they're ruled by a king or a queen. Typically, there's other titles that are involved in as well. Kind of the textbook example of this is the United Kingdom. However, we'll have further conversation when you do your iCivets packet on the limitations of the monarchy in the United Kingdom. The next type of government is an oligarchy. An oligarchy and a dictatorship are kind of similar. However, instead of looking at the ultimate rule of one person, it's looking at the rule of a few people that are typically all from the elite class, meaning the upper class. Generally speaking, they are different families that have a lot of money within the society and come together to rule. An example of this would be in modern day Russia. The next example is a republic. A republic and a democracy have a lot of overlap, and again, this is something we're going to talk more about in the next mini lesson. A republic, by definition, is a government ruled by representatives. Generally speaking, in a republic, citizens can vote individuals out of office if they don't like their choices they're making. This is typically why there are term limits. So, for example, in the United States, presidents are limited to a 4-year term limit. The members of the House of Representatives are limited to 4 years. The members of the Senate are limited to 6 years. The members of the state representatives are 4 years. The governors 4 years. So ultimately, if they're not liking how the country is being run, they can choose to vote someone else into office. A republic is the most common type of government, and it is what the United States is considered. A theocracy is a government where the leaders are considered divine or religious in nature. They typically follow religious laws. This was one of the most common types of governments in civilization. So, for example, dating back to ancient Egypt, the pharaohs were considered divine leaders who were said to have direct contact with the gods. They were people, or they were figures that people were worshiping, and religion became a central feature of their society. A modern day example is Saudi Arabia, where Islam is a large part of their government system. A military junta is probably one you haven't even heard of before. A military junta is typically speaking, a temporary government system. It's typically made up of a committee or an administrative council who rules after a coup. So this happens when a revolt or a revolution or a coup happens. People overthrow the government and they have to put something in place temporarily in the place of a government until they figure out what the new government's going to look like. An example of this was when Spain was overthrown in 1808. Socialism is kind of an overlap in terms of the economy and politics. It looks at both the government, but it also looks at the economy as well. It is based on collective common or public ownership. There is some overlap within anarchy on that as well. A historical example of this would be Cuba. Ultimately, socialism typically doesn't exist for a long time because there is not a formal government system enforcing laws. The last type government we're going to look at is tribal governments. This is not necessarily a type of government in the way that the other ones are, but it is looking at a type of government system. Tribal governments each have their own government and constitution. So different Native American tribes throughout the United States have their own government. They have their own constitution. Sometimes they have treaties with one another. Sometimes they don't. It really depends. There are some similarities. They're definitely rooted in democracy. Some of the ideas from the original Native American tribes are found in the Constitution to this day. So, for example, the Iroquois Confederacy was formed by 5 Native American tribes, and a lot of their ideas are rooted in separation of power and checks and balances. So, we'll look at that primary document later on in the semester. Generally, tribal governments are responsible for providing their own services. So, for example, they typically pay for their own first responders, their own education systems, their own healthcare systems, their own roads. However, in order to be able to do that, typically they will task the members of the tribe or individuals who are not members of the tribe that are living on the tribal territory. Typically speaking, they have a working relationship with local, state, and federal governments. However, as we'll learn about later on in the school year, as well as you have learned in U.S. history, this has kind of been a bumpy relationship throughout history. There have been tribal governments pretty much in every country throughout the world. However, the example for the purposes of this class we're focusing on are the Native American tribes found throughout the United States.